Okay, here we are. It's a Sunday morning, a little bit late this week. Obviously, owing to the demands of family life. I have a young son, far too young for a guy of my age, to be honest. But I'll do my best, and I will do to the day I shuffle off my mortal coil. But it's not the subject of today's video. Basically, I wanted to talk about what's happened to the UK, Britain, what's happened to this culture, and that sort of thing. So first of all, I thought I'd try to put it in context. So perhaps a little personal history at the start. I was born 69 years ago, a little bit, a very cold January morning, around about 6 o'clock apparently, and I spent the first 5 years of my life in the east end of London, a place called Canning Town. I think it's called Canning Town because it's named after a canning factory, I believe. A very former industrial docklands, that sort of thing. And docklands meant there were actually docks there. And the area was, at the time, slowly recovering from the attentions of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, in about a decade earlier. They'd, to put it politely, bombed the living daylights out of the area. And I grew up at that stage of my life thinking that the best playgrounds around were bomb sites. That's basically all we had. But it was quite fun, really, as I remember anyway. It's a long time ago, obviously. There was, even then, I was kind of aware of a certain attitude. You grew up becoming increasingly aware of attitudes and things that were expected of you. And the community was East End London. Technically not Cockneys, but definitely East Enders. But they had a sort of unique charm to them, and a way about them and all that. That was contiguous. It had been kind of grown quite naturally out of the trials and tribulations of life in those days. And although it's unique in its own way, there was a sense of homogeneity. I can't even say that word. Homogeneity, that's better. Basically most cultures, or more or less all cultures around the UK, would recognise and share similar values. My father was lucky enough to get a really nice flat in Shooters Hill just before I went to primary school. And so actually most of my growing up in a relatively, in those days at least, a relatively middle class area. School life was permeated by things like assemblies and chats about recent history and all that sort of thing. We had a sense of who we were, what the world was all about, what our place in the world was, what was expected of us within the society, and kind of expectations of how a person should behave. Things like loyalty, decency, honesty, perseverance, and good qualities, sense of duty, a sense of patriotism to a large extent at that stage, of having just been through such a drastic challenge to us. Not surprising that patriotism should be very high back in those days. But it was all quite cohesive. We all kind of knew what we were doing and what the society was all about. That began to change towards the end of my period in Shooters Hill. It began to change. We're moving into the 60s, the mid and late 60s. Rock and roll was about, and hippies, flower power, that sort of thing. And there were a lot of quite revolutionary forces who were struggling against what they saw as conservative forces. They thought they were making a positive difference. In some ways there were many good things came out of those years. But they were struggling to kind of create a kind of revolution, and values were being challenged at a very fundamental level. Morning guys. Morning. So half the people, or more than half the people involved, didn't really know what they were fighting for. But we began to change direction as a society. The underlying assumptions we needed to, probably needed to change, but maybe not always in the directions that we did change. In the 70s we started getting quite large influxes of people from Africa, curiously mostly Asians, mostly escaping persecution in places like Kenya first of all, and then later Uganda. And the demographics of the country started to change. A large West Indian population as well, or getting larger. It wasn't that large back then, but it was getting larger. The buzzword became, as we moved into the 70s, apparently it was all about integration. That people from other cultures were supposed to move into the country, and the idea was they would integrate into the way of life. And the expectation was that into the underlying assumptions of the culture that was already here. But as time went by, it became increasingly obvious that wasn't going to happen. What happened instead was a kind of ghettoisation. I use that word again this week. People tended to live amongst others of a similar culture. The mixing, there was some mixing, but nothing like to the extent that those people who spoke of integration foresaw. It was pretty weak. People wanted to stay within cultural groups that they understood. They knew their place. And this is quite an understandable human reaction to the situation. Perhaps particularly so when you are an immigrant. Your sense of identity is challenged to some extent by the society around you. So there'll be a tendency to cling to a lot of the older ways. So that created tensions, and also tensions between. There were tensions between cultures. Different immigrant cultures would not particularly like each other. Like Hindus wouldn't particularly like Muslims, and there'd be pressures and tensions between those, and sometimes the odd battle of one sort or another, odd riot. And also tensions, actually particularly between West Indian groups and the underlying culture. We had in 81, first of all, if I remember correctly. I was kind of in the thick of it a bit myself. I was living in London and working in the brigade control at the time. And we had a thing called the Brixton riots, which caused chaos for us as mobilising officers. And we struggled to understand why people attacked fire engines. They were only there to help them. Attacked fire crews. Quite a few fire crews got stoned, or bottles were thrown at them, or Molotov cocktail, that sort of thing. Also riots, as I remember. I think it was 85. We had Broadwater Farm when a PC was killed. I believe he was hacked to death. So yeah, pretty unpleasant, but clearly there were problems with the idea of integration. It wasn't really working. So eventually the idea, I think it was more of a sort of make do and mend kind of approach from the powers that be. Instead of integration, we were told that we were going to be a multicultural society. The idea, I think the underlying idea, kind of preposterous as it was that we were going to have an eclectic society where the best of all the different groups would come to the fore. I suppose you could say it's actually been the case with food. Certainly the choice in restaurants is much better these days. That part of it I think has been positive, but many other aspects certainly weren't. And it was a bit of a myth. It was almost a euphemistic idea to cover the very obvious cracks that were appearing and continue to appear. This kind of went on for some time, but kind of up until the mid-90s, clearly the country was kind of fraying at the edges culturally. We were struggling with this a bit, but it was still relatively cohesive. We still had a kind of Christian philosophical outlook, the kind of outlook that had been with us for 1,000 years and had served us well through thick and thin. But those attitudes were coming under fire increasingly. In I think it was 97, There was an election after a few disastrous years of the major government. Perhaps the worst Prime Minister we've ever had, although he's got quite a lot of pretty stiff competition. The current guy, Mr. Sunak, is pretty awful, but I kind of find it, I struggle to regard him as Prime Minister. As he won no election, he more or less purloined the leadership of this country. More or less a non-violent coup in my eyes, but maybe I'm exceptional on that, but I don't see that he has any legitimacy whatsoever as Prime Minister. But anyway, that's a different subject. 1997, a certain, I think his name was Anthony Linton Charles Blair, became Prime Minister. And I remember he came with huge personal charm, so he came with this youthful energy and promise for the future. I remember the election night, everyone was very fired up, and there was a song at the time, "Things Can Only Get Better." Yes, you've got to watch those sort of dreams. Things can get a lot worse too. Blair was a master of spin, soundbite politics, of presentation, and using the press in certain ways. He cozied up to Rupert Murdoch in order to increase his power within the press. And he embarked on a range of disastrous policies in all sorts of areas. So many and so bad that it's hard to kind of single out which ones were the worst. But the effect on the country was dramatic and extremely negative. Let's think of three. Devolution has been terrible, has created all sorts of tensions amongst Scots and the English, the Welsh and the English, the whole country being riven this way and that. All sorts of intergroup struggles that weren't there before. When really we grew up, when I grew up, I just thought of myself as British, not English. It was just natural to assume that you were part of this one group, the United Kingdom. But so that was under attack. I suppose the obvious example with Blair was the wars that he indulged in. We seemed to get involved in a lot more wars suddenly, and to lend legitimacy to all sorts of movements that were not necessarily natural allies, shall we say. During World War II, for example, the Serbs had been very good allies to us. The Croatians not so. And there'd been, well, I mean, I could go back for the history of that, but essentially the Serbs were on our side and the Croatians were not. The Croatians were more or less on the German side. So when we turned on the Serbs in one of Blair's wars, it was a bit of a stab in the back, to be honest. I think the Serbian people were not expecting that. But perhaps the most egregious example was Iraq. Basically, he just lied. The idea that there were weapons of mass destruction, there weren't. The idea that Saddam Hussein could attack London, of course it couldn't. Complete madness. The idea it had anything to do with 9/11, again, complete madness. Hello, you. Hello, I've got to keep this thing going because I'm trying to record a podcast. So I'm chatting away to myself here. Okay.
I've got a broom.
You got what? You're a witch. The witch on the broomstick. Is that you? The room on the broom, yeah?
I found it.
Ah, you found it. It's a good one you found there.
We just planted some trees.
You planted some trees. Well done. By the time you're a little old, they should be quite big, shouldn't they?
Yeah.
I would hope.
I planted one tree in the river, but then it was too big.
It will take a few years to grow. By the time you're in your teenage years, you should have a grown tree. Hopefully.
Maybe.
That would be cool, wouldn't it?
You can say bye.
See you later, right? See you in a pub,
Enjoy
maybe.
your podcast.
Right, bye-bye, guys. Okay, so some friends. Oh, acquaintances, very decent, nice people. Where were we? Yeah, Iraq, complete, taken to war on lies, basically. That's a pretty egregious act on Blair's part. Quite deliberately, cold-bloodedly lying, and his team of spin doctors, one in particular I can remember, but well, there's a whole group of them though, and they were probably as evil a group as you could kind of put together. It was all about how to deceive people, and it's all done with words that were, you know, we're saying in other podcasts, they managed to paint it in glowing terms, and to persuade people that what we were doing was a good thing, while we were busily murdering hundreds of thousands of perfectly innocent people. Not good. But as far as this particular subject goes, perhaps the most egregious was freedom of movement. Blair was a globalist. He had no respect whatsoever for British values, for Britain, for what we stood for. He liked the idea of globalism, and basically, I suppose eventually the final thing will be worldwide government, essentially where we seem to be heading today, by force rather than actually asking people what they want. But he signed up to the freedom of movement about a year before the French or the Germans. I have to look up that for an exact fact, but it was way before the Germans and the French. Hence, we attracted huge amounts of people from Eastern Europe. The French and the Germans had rightly thought if we suddenly open our borders, we'll be flooded with these people. But we went ahead anyway. Now, we were assured by by Blair himself and by the spin doctors that we would only get a few hundred, or maybe a few, 2,000 or 3,000 at most. The numbers were supposed to be very small. I remember seeing the article on the BBC, a person waiting at Gatwick Airport and only coming across, I think it was one Romanian, and we were sold this idea that it wasn't really going to affect the society. There weren't going to be major changes because of that. But what actually happened is by 2018, the official figure was 3.6 million. Rather than just a few hundred, 3.6 million. And that was the official figure. It's speculated, but you can't prove it one way or t'other, that far more were involved. So we may have had 5 or 6 million. Just huge numbers, society-changing numbers. Now, I want to be fair at this point. If people, I bear no animosity whatsoever to these people. Are just, the same as anyone else really. They have their own cultural assumptions and all that. But there's nothing intrinsically wrong with these people. They were doing the best for themselves and their families. This is perfectly natural, reasonable human behaviour. So it's not the problem of the people themselves I've got any beef with whatsoever. In fact, I've got rather strong respect for people from Poland, Bulgaria, Romania. They seem pretty decent to me. But the problem was very definitely with the policy. It was designed to undermine and essentially water down British culture, to tear it apart, to take the fabric, the woof and weave of British society apart. And I was sad to say it succeeded. By now we're in March of 2023. I'm sad to say there is no British culture. No, little bits of it here and there, just flickering embers of a once fabulous culture. But what we have left is just the remnants, the bottom of the grate, if you will. It's been rather sad, and it's not going to get any better. If anything, it will probably get even worse. So the complete obliteration of British cultural assumptions is what is sought, and it will not stop until that is the case. If you're going for a globalist world, you want to break down identity on national lines. So the idea that one belongs to a certain culture, French or German, Dutch, or indeed British. You need to break that down. You need to get this sense of you belong to some pan-national body, such as the EU. I mean, that's at one level. And beyond the EU, that we should be giving allegiance to such bodies as the WEF or the WHO, World Economic Forum, or the World Health Organization. Both have acted in quite disgraceful ways in recent years. And both are essentially globalist entities that essentially seek power over national governments, and have achieved it to a large extent. So there is this continuous effort that Mr. Blair, to this day, is still deeply involved in, still deeply aligned with this idea of breaking down what is Britain, really. To think that this man was Prime Minister of Britain is, you know, it's, I don't know, it's like leaving Dracula in charge of a blood bank. It's just crazy. So, yeah, we have the position we're in today, which is pretty sad. You know, as a person born and raised in my country, born and raised in Britain, and feeling a certain allegiance to the place I come from and the culture that I was part of, it saddens me to say that it doesn't exist. There is, in a sense, there's no point in trying to grasp what's left, because there is nothing there. It's interesting historically. It's interesting what was achieved by this country, by this culture. Quite fabulous history, quite amazing achievements, industrial revolution, things like that. Philosophically, musically, artistically, literature in particular, the likes of Jane Austen, Shakespeare, Dickens, Trollope. It just goes on and on. You know, the list is too long for me to even start to attempt. But yeah, all that has sadly met its demise. So we are left where we are today, which is in this strange state where the realisation that government has not been there for the sake of the people of this country, and it is not today. I mean, Sunak's government is not there for our sake. Mr. Sunak has got closer ties to the WEF than he has to Britain. Yeah, it's basically the demise of what we once were. It's over. So sorry to bring such bad news, but it is over, and there's little point in pretending otherwise. The question is, what do we do from here? Not an easy question to answer, but maybe more of that another week. As ever, like, subscribe, comment if you will. I'll try to get this article out on Substack. Be a bit more in depth, and the figures that I quote will be more accurate. And yeah, I'll be able to talk about these things in ways that will kind of flesh it out a little more. But for now, hopefully, all being well, see you next week.